The floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite mirrored the city lights like cold, electric diamonds. Beyond the glass, the skyline stood unaware of the silent war unfolding over the mahogany desk. Carmela Walter, radiant in a tailored ivory dress, scrolled through her phone with a sharp, impatient thumb, her jewelry catching the light like jagged shards. Across from her sat Ray John. He was a study in stillness, a man of dark suits and tattooed skin hidden beneath expensive cotton. One finger was raised, not in a plea, but with the calculated patience of a predator. "Be realistic, Ray," Carmela said, her voice dripping with the casual cruelty of the powerful. "You wouldn't last a month without my income. You're a ghost in this house." A faint holographic projection shimmered between them, glowing with a mocking, empty figure. $0. Ray's expression didn't flicker. "Are you sure about that?" The air in the room didn't just chill, it solidified. Carmela saw a man she thought she owned, but for the first time she felt the weight of the gravity he exerted. She was about to learn that Ray didn't measure his worth in salaries. He measured it in influence, and tonight he was calling in every debt. The office was a shrine to opulence, every surface gleaming with a sterile, expensive light that made Ray's presence feel like a smudge on a masterpiece. Carmela leaned back in her leather throne, gesturing dismissively at the shimmering holographic display between them. It projected a massive, glowing zero, a digital void that she treated like a punchline. "Look at it, Ray," she sneered, her voice dripping with a practiced cruelty. "The absolute sum of your worth. You're a placeholder, a ghost in a suit I paid for." He took the lash with a practiced, hollow smile, enduring the sharp giggles of her assistant, who hovered nearby like a well-dressed vulture. To them, he was the invisible man, a tragic byproduct of Carmela's success. Yet, as the insults blurred into background noise, Ray's thumb traced the edge of the encrypted tablet hidden beneath the mahogany table. With a single, silent biometric scan, he finalized the authorization for the Vanguard-Aegis merger. While they mocked his empty balance, Ray moved $1 billion across the global market with a twitch of his finger, a silent titan hiding behind a mask of nothingness. The penthouse suite buzzed with the frantic energy of a kingdom preparing for its queen's ascent. Carmela stood before a triptych of mirrors, her silhouette sharpened by $1,000 blazer that felt more like armor than silk. To her, today wasn't just a promotion, it was a coronation, the final erasure of any doubt regarding her dominance. Ray sat on the periphery, a silent fixture in the room's expensive geography, as she barked orders to a fleet of stylists. "Move the car, Ray," she tossed over her shoulder without looking, her voice devoid of even a hint of shared history. "And try to stay in the lobby. Your energy is dampening the aesthetic of the executive floor." She treated his presence like a smudge on a lens, an embarrassing afterthought from a life she had long since outgrown. Her assistant scurried past him, nearly tripping over his feet as if he were a piece of misplaced furniture. Ray merely adjusted his cufflink, the gold catching a sliver of the morning sun. While she rehearsed her victory speech, he watched the silent data stream on his vision-linked contact lenses. She was walking into a boardroom she thought she owned, unaware that the very chair she coveted was now legally under his thumb. The transition from the penthouse to the subterranean silence of the concrete bunker felt like stepping from a stage into the engine room of the world. In this theater of shadows, the invisible man discarded his submissiveness like a soiled garment. Ray took his seat at the head of a stark, obsidian table, the air turning frigid as his 4 lieutenants, men who controlled the flow of global logistics and digital shadows, sat in rigid, terrifying silence. There were no insults here, only the heavy, suffocating weight of absolute loyalty. A dossier was slid toward him. It was the ink-and-blood reality of the merger he had authorized hours earlier. "The board is in place, sir," the lead operative whispered, his eyes never rising above Ray's tie. "They believe the acquisition is hostile. They have no idea it's yours." Ray leaned forward, the cold light of the monitors reflecting in his gaze with a predatory sharpness. The mask of the bumbling husband was gone, replaced by the terrifying clarity of a man who didn't just play the game. He owned the board. One word from him would now dismantle Carmela's world, turning her coronation into a public execution of her ambitions. The crystal chandeliers of the gala cast a fractured light over the evening's elite, their laughter chiming like the sharpening of knives. Carmela stood at the center of the circle, her champagne flute held high as she regaled her fellow directors with the comedic tragedy of her domestic life. "He's practically a decorative piece at this point," she chuckled, her voice carrying across the marble foyer with a melodic cruelty. Her colleagues leaned in, their smiles predatory. "Tell us, Ray," one of the junior partners sneered, his eyes scanning Ray's unassuming frame. "What does a man with zero prospects actually do during a Tuesday matinee? Or is the unemployment check enough to cover your hobbies?" Ray stood at the edge of the light, a silent spectator to his own character assassination. He watched Carmela's eyes. There was no flicker of defense, only a cold, performative glee as she joined the chorus of mockery. She laughed at the man she believed was her shadow, unaware that the very foundation of the room they stood in was already shifting beneath her heels. Ray took a slow sip of water, his expression unreadable and perfectly still. He wasn't just enduring the ridicule. He was cataloging every face in the circle, noting exactly who would be the first to beg for mercy when the dawn finally broke. The ride home was a suffocating vacuum of silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the city passing in a blur of neon. Ray turned his gaze from the window, his voice quiet, almost a whisper of a hope he knew was already dead. "Do you ever think about the beginning, Carmela? Before the titles and the galas, we were a team once." It was a lifeline thrown into a dark sea, a final invitation for her to reach back across the chasm of her own vanity. She didn't even turn her head. A cold, sharp laugh escaped her as she adjusted her diamond earring in the vanity mirror. "The beginning was a lifetime ago, Ray. I grew up. You stayed exactly where you were at the bottom." She looked at him then, her eyes reflecting nothing but the polished surface of her own ego. "Don't mistake my tolerance for affection. You're a liability to the image I've built, and frankly, the only thing you're a team with is the furniture." The door to his heart didn't just close, it locked. Ray nodded once, the mercy in his eyes replaced by the cold, calculated precision of the man who was about to take it all back. Ray didn't need a sledgehammer to dismantle her world. He only needed a scalpel and the cold glow of a terminal. While Carmela slept in a suite funded by a ghost, Ray's fingers danced across the interface of a private offshore ledger, systematically severing the silent lifelines that kept her empire afloat. He began with the shell companies, the invisible scaffolding of her high society credit lines, and the discretionary funds that masked her mounting corporate debts. One by one, the digital pillars vanished into the ether. By morning, the trembling began. Carmela's phone became a frantic pulse on the nightstand, vibrating with urgent alerts from her chief financial officer. A massive, unexplained liquidity vacuum had opened beneath her flagship project, and the prestigious firm she thought she commanded was suddenly gasping for air. She paced the marble floor, her face pale as she screamed into her headset, demanding to know where the capital had gone. Ray sat in the kitchen, calmly sipping his coffee and reading the morning news. He watched her spiral, a silent architect observing the first cracks in a foundation she never realized was built entirely on his permission. The ballroom was a sea of silk and predatory ambition, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the whispered fawning of the city's power brokers. Carmela ascended the stage like a deity returning to her temple, the spotlight catching the cold fire of her diamonds as she looked out over the crowd. Ray stood in the dim periphery, a glass of untouched water in his hand, watching the woman he once loved prepare to commit her final act of betrayal. "Success isn't given, it's taken," Carmela began, her voice projected with a chilling, magnetic confidence. "I built this empire while others slept. I climbed every rung of this ladder alone, unburdened by the weight of those who lack the vision to see the summit." She didn't look at Ray, but the intentionality of her words hung in the air like a guillotine. The elite erupted in thunderous applause, celebrating the myth of her solo ascent. Ray simply watched her, a ghost at his own funeral, knowing that the ladder she boasted of was a gallows he had designed. And tonight, he was finally ready to pull the lever. The applause was still ringing in the rafters when Ray stepped toward the tech booth, his movements fluid and unnoticed, like a shadow merging with the wall. Carmela stood center stage, bathing in the adoration of a room that believed she was untouchable. With a ghost of a smile, Ray pressed his thumb to the sleek glass of his device, bypass protocols slicing through the gala's secure network. The massive projection screen behind Carmela flickered, the celebratory montage of her solo achievements dissolving into a cold, rhythmic pulse of raw data. The room went silent as the gold-leafed graphics were replaced by a sprawling map of offshore capital. Bright, incriminating lines of light bled from her corporate accounts, snaking through a dozen tax havens before converging into a single, massive terminal. Every dollar she had used to buy her status was being tracked in real time, and the name at the center of the web wasn't hers. It was his. The invisible man was suddenly the only person anyone could see. As the board realized the entire empire was a hollow shell owned by the man they had just spent the evening mocking, Carmela turned, her face ashen, watching her reflection drown in a sea of his digital ink. The silence that followed the digital revelation was heavier than any applause. Carmela stood frozen, a shattered monument to her own vanity, her eyes darting from the screen to the man she had called a liability. Ray didn't offer a parting insult. The data spoke with a cold, mathematical finality that no shout could match. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing in the hollowed-out silence of the ballroom. Stopping just inches away, he leaned in, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. "You didn't build this, Carmela. I simply let you believe you did. You were never the architect, you were the tenant, and your lease just expired." He turned his back on the wreckage of her career, walking through the crowd of stunned elites who parted like a retreating tide. As he stepped out of the gala and into the crisp night air, the facade of the unassuming husband vanished entirely. A fleet of black sedans waited at the curb, their engines humming in a synchronized, low-frequency growl. His lieutenants stood at attention, doors held open for the man who no longer needed to hide. Ray settled into the leather seat, the city lights reflecting in his eyes not as decorations, but as assets. The invisible man was dead. The king had finally come home. This concludes Ray's journey from the shadows to the throne.